Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. I hadn't seen Ben in months, not since we tossed our caps into the air and walked off into the world as newly graduated adults, ready to take on life. Ben had moved to some tiny town up north, far from the noise and chaos of the city. He said it was peaceful, a place where he could find himself, or whatever. I figured it was just his way of running from responsibility, but who was I to judge? When Ben called and invited me up for the weekend, I said yes without hesitation. It felt like the right way to break the monotony of my day-to-day routine. Plus, I missed him. Ben had been my closest friend through college, and life felt kind of empty without him around. I arrived late Friday night. Ben's new place was a cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a little creepy, I'll admit, but Ben was thrilled with the isolation. "It's peaceful, man," he kept saying, smiling in that way that made me think he was either really happy or slowly losing his mind. The next day, we decided to go hiking. Ben said he'd found a trail a few miles from his place that led through some old woods. Sounded good to me. Fresh air, no people, a chance to catch up. We packed a couple of sandwiches and headed out mid-morning, walking along a dirt path that quickly turned into dense, overgrown woods. The air was thick with humidity, and the sun was barely cutting through the trees. After an hour or so, it became clear that Ben didn't exactly know where this trail was leading us. We were lost, or at least I felt that way. The woods all looked the same. Twisted trees, thick brush, and a kind of stillness that put me on edge. Ben, of course, brushed it off. "We'll find our way," he said, pushing branches aside as we wandered deeper into the forest. But I wasn't so sure. We kept walking for what felt like hours, and then, through a gap in the trees, I saw it, a church. Or at least it had been a church once. The place looked ancient, like it had been swallowed by the forest. The roof sagged, half collapsed, and vines crawled up the stone walls, strangling what was left of the building. There was something unsettling about it, a kind of heaviness that pressed down on my chest as we got closer. "We should check it out," Ben said, already walking toward the broken wooden doors. I hesitated. Something about that place didn't feel right, but I followed him anyway. I wasn't about to be the one to chicken out. Inside, the air was musty and thick with the smell of damp wood and rot. The pews were mostly intact but covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like snow. At the front, an altar stood, draped in a torn and stained cloth. It was hard to tell if anyone had been in here recently, but it felt like the place had been abandoned for decades. That's when I noticed them. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw them, people. They were sitting in the pews, dressed in ragged clothes, staring at us with blank, empty eyes. I felt my stomach twist. There was something wrong about them, something off. "Hey," Ben whispered, his voice shaky. "Let's get out of here." I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and hurried toward the door, but as we reached it, I felt eyes on me. I glanced back, and my heart stopped. The people, if you could even call them that, were standing now, watching us. They hadn't made a sound, hadn't moved a muscle, but there they were, just staring. We bolted. I don't know how far we ran or for how long, but we didn't stop until we were sure we'd lost sight of that cursed church. My legs felt like jelly, and my lungs burned from the effort, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far from that place as possible. We stumbled onto a narrow dirt road that wound through the forest. It was a relief to see something other than trees and that eerie church. We kept walking, hoping to find our way back to Ben's place or at least some sign of civilization. But then I heard footsteps behind us. I froze, and so did Ben. Slowly, we turned around. Sure enough, a few of those people from the church were standing at the edge of the trees, just watching us. They weren't following, not exactly, but their presence sent a chill down my spine. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on us, cold and unblinking. "We need to find a road," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. Ben nodded, his face pale. We picked up the pace, not running but moving fast enough that the distance between us and them grew wider. Eventually, we found a gas station, a rundown little place that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The guy behind the counter was ancient, his leathery face creased with wrinkles and his eyes a dull gray. He looked up as we walked in, raising an eyebrow. "Y'all look like you've seen a ghost," he said, chuckling to himself. I told him we were lost and asked if he could point us in the direction of the main road. He nodded and gave us some vague instructions, something about following the road until it forked, then heading left. But before we left, he leaned in, lowering his voice. "Stay clear of them woods. Folks around here talk about strange things happening. Crazy witch folks, they say. Best to keep away." I didn't need any more convincing. I thanked him and dragged Ben back outside. We followed his directions, and soon enough, we found ourselves back on a proper road, the kind that actually led somewhere. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Ben stayed quiet for most of the walk back. Neither of us mentioned the church, or the people, or the gas station guy's warning. But I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Something was seriously wrong with those woods. The sun was setting by the time we finally reached the highway. The stretch of asphalt was like a lifeline, a promise that we were finally out of those woods and back to some semblance of safety. My legs felt like they might give out any second, and I could tell Ben wasn't doing much better. His face was pale, beads of sweat clinging to his forehead despite the cool evening air. We walked in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't shake the images from the church, those vacant stairs, the eerie stillness. And then there was the gas station attendant's warning about witch folks. What the hell had we stumbled into? I was still mulling it over when a police cruiser pulled up beside us, its lights flashing, but no siren. The window rolled down, and a middle-aged officer with a thick mustache leaned out. "You boys lost?" His voice was gruff, but there was a note of concern in it. Ben nodded. "Yeah, we got turned around in the woods." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You don't say. Been hearing about folks getting lost around these parts lately. Dangerous place, those woods. Best you steer clear from now on." He opened the door and gestured for us to get in. Normally, I wouldn't hop into a stranger's car, even if it was a cop, but after everything we'd been through, I wasn't about to argue. I slid into the back seat, and Ben followed suit. As we drove, the officer made small talk, asking where we were from, what we were doing out here. But I could tell he knew something he wasn't saying. I finally worked up the nerve to ask. "Officer, do you know anything about that old church back in the woods?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I thought he might not answer. But then he sighed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, I know it. Ain't no church anymore, though. Place has been abandoned for years, maybe longer. Folks around here say it's cursed. Bunch of crazies used to meet there, some kind of cult or something. They'd perform rituals, sacrifice animals, you know the type. But that was a long time ago. The church has been empty ever since." "Then who were those people?" Ben asked, his voice low and shaky. "The ones in the church?" The officer glanced at us in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "You sure you saw people?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. I knew what I saw, and I knew Ben had seen it too. But the officer's tone made me question everything. Could we have imagined it? No. I refused to believe that. "Well, whatever you saw, best you leave it behind. Some things are better left alone," the officer said, his voice taking on a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. He dropped us off near Ben's cabin, just as the last light of day was fading. We thanked him and watched as his cruiser disappeared down the road, the red taillights vanishing into the darkness. Ben and I didn't talk much that night. We sat on the porch, sipping beers and staring into the trees. There was an oppressive silence in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I kept expecting to see those people again, lurking at the edge of the woods, watching us with their empty eyes. But the trees remained still, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside had me on edge. When morning finally came, I felt like I hadn't closed my eyes at all. We decided to head out early. The plan was to get me back to my car and for me to head home, far away from these cursed woods and whatever we had stumbled into. Ben didn't argue. He seemed just as eager to put this place behind him. As we drove down the narrow road that led out of the forest, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Part of me was glad to be leaving, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. The events of the day before still clung to me, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. We passed by the gas station again. The old man wasn't there this time, and the place looked even more rundown in the daylight, if that was possible. I half expected to see one of those figures from the church standing there, watching us as we drove by, but the place was deserted. We reached the highway, and Ben turned onto the main road, the trees slowly giving way to open fields. I should have felt better, but I didn't. Something still gnawed at the back of my mind, an itch I couldn't scratch. I glanced at Ben. He was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. I could tell he felt it too. Just when I thought we were finally free, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a shape, a dark blur in the distance. But as it got closer, I realized it wasn't just a shape, it was a person. No, not just one person. Several. My heart sank. I recognized them immediately, the people from the church. They were walking along the side of the road, heading in the same direction we were. Their heads were down, their faces obscured by shadows, but I knew it was them. I could feel their presence, cold and unsettling, even from this distance. "Ben," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "They're following us." He didn't respond at first, but when he looked in the rearview mirror, I saw his eyes widen. He slammed his foot on the gas, the engine roaring as we sped down the highway. But no matter how fast we went, the figures remained behind us, always just out of reach but never fading from sight. "They're not real," Ben muttered to himself, shaking his head as if trying to convince himself. "They can't be real." But I knew better. They were real as the fear tightening in my chest. And somehow, they had followed us. They had left the woods, crossed over into our world, and now they were coming for us. We didn't stop until we reached the next town. Ben pulled into a gas station, and we sat there for a long time, either of us speaking. I looked in the mirror again, but the road was empty. The figures were gone. But I knew they weren't really gone. Not for good. Somehow, I had a feeling they would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to find us again. And next time, we might not be so lucky. It was a warm Sunday afternoon in the middle of nowhere. Sarah and I had been driving for hours, letting the GPS take us down backroads through the sprawling countryside of Warren County, Georgia. We weren't looking for anything in particular, just a break from the noise of the city, a chance to explore some place untouched by time. You know the kind of drive where you let yourself get lost, thinking maybe you'll stumble upon a hidden gem. That's what we were hoping for. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt when we noticed it. Off to the side of the road, tucked behind a few overgrown trees, was a small, weathered sign that read, St. Mark's Church. The sign looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the paint chipped and faded. But what caught my eye wasn't the sign, it was the parking lot full of cars. They were old, dusty trucks and sedans, most of them looking like they hadn't seen a car wash in years. "Do you think there's a service going on?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but curious, the way it always was when something intrigued her. I shrugged. "Maybe. Out here? Could be a Sunday service, or some kind of town meeting." She smiled at me, that half smile that always got us into some kind of adventure, or trouble. "Let's check it out." I hesitated, staring at the church. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the fact that the building looked like it could collapse at any moment. Or maybe it was just the eerie silence that surrounded the place. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the trees, just silence. But of course I nodded. Yeah, why not? We parked at the edge of the lot, slipping into one of the few empty spots. The church itself was small, the kind of one-room chapel you see in movies about small towns. Its white paint was peeling, the windows were dirty, and the steeple leaned slightly to one side, like it was too tired to hold itself up any longer. As we approached, I noticed something odd. For all the cars outside, there was barely any noise coming from within. No singing, no voices. Just the faintest murmur of something off. But Sarah, ever the adventurer, was already heading for the front door. Inside, the church was dimly lit. The first thing that hit me was the smell, stale air, mixed with the scent of wood and something else, something faintly metallic. The pews were mostly empty, save for a few men scattered here and there. I could tell right away they weren't your typical churchgoers. Most of them were in their 30s or 40s, and every single one of them looked up when we entered, their eyes locking onto us like they had been expecting something, or someone, but not us. There was no warmth in their stares. No welcome. Just a cold, quiet scrutiny that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Sarah stopped just inside the doorway, and I could see her hesitate for the first time. Maybe we should leave, a voice said, cutting through the silence like a knife. At first, I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Then I saw him, a man standing at the front of the church, near the altar. He was tall, wearing a suit that looked out of place here, the way it hung loosely off his shoulders. His face was hidden behind a mask, one of those old porcelain ones that almost looked like a human face but just a bit wrong. The eyes were too wide, the mouth too small. Sarah and I exchanged a look. We didn't mean to interrupt. I started, trying to keep my voice steady, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. The man didn't move. He didn't need to. The others in the church were already starting to stand slowly, their eyes still locked on us. You shouldn't be here, the man with the mask said, his voice low and deliberate. This isn't for you. There was something in the way he said it that made my stomach twist. We were just passing by. Sarah tried, her voice calm, though I could tell she was on edge too. We didn't realize. Leave, the man repeated, but this time it wasn't a suggestion. I reached for Sarah's hand, pulling her gently toward the door. We're going, I said, trying not to look at any of the men now standing in the aisles. As we turned to leave, I felt their eyes follow us, and I swear I could hear the sound of something scraping along the floor behind us. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. Outside, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the lot. We hurried to the car, the tension between us so thick neither of us spoke until we were both inside with the doors locked. What the hell was that? Sarah finally asked, her voice shaking just a little. I don't know, I said, starting the car. My hands were trembling, and I had to take a deep breath to steady them. But let's get out of here. I backed out of the lot, the gravel crunching under the tires as we sped back onto the main road. My heart was racing, and I could see Sarah glancing back at the church as we drove away. That was weird, right? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I agreed. Really weird. For a moment neither of us spoke. The sun was nearly gone now, the sky darkening as night crept in. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, just to be sure we weren't being followed. But the road behind us was empty. Or so I thought. A few miles down the road, I noticed headlights in the distance. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It's a rural area, after all. But then I realized they were gaining on us fast. Is that? Sarah began, turning to look behind us. I don't know, I muttered, pressing the gas pedal a little harder. The engine groaned, the old car not exactly built for speed. The van, because that's what it was, an old, beat-up van, was closing the distance between us. My pulse quickened as I realized whoever was in that van wasn't just driving. They were following us. I glanced at Sarah, and the look on her face told me she knew it too. "Hang on," I said, my voice tight as I slammed my foot down on the gas. The car's engine roared as we sped down the narrow, winding road, the trees blurring past on either side. The van behind us was relentless, its headlights looming closer with every passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, and Sarah clutched the seat beside me, her knuckles white. Neither of us spoke, but the fear in the air was thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. "They're getting closer," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," I muttered, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The van was no more than a few car lengths behind now, its high beams blinding in the darkening night. I took a sharp turn, the tires screeching on the asphalt, but the van stuck to us like a shadow. There was something unnerving about the way it followed, calm, methodical, like they had all the time in the world and knew exactly where we were going. My mind raced with possibilities. What was this? Who were these people? Had we stumbled into something far worse than we imagined? The memory of that masked man in the church flashed in my mind, his cold voice telling us to leave. I thought we had left. But now, it seemed like we hadn't left far enough. "They're not backing off," Sarah said, her voice breaking with panic. I shook my head, trying to keep my own fear in check. "I'm gonna try to lose them." The road twisted again, leading us deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, the night darker. I pressed the gas harder, pushing the old car as fast as it could go, but the van stayed right on our tail, its headlights flickering in the rearview mirror like some predator's eyes. "Maybe we should call someone," Sarah suggested, fumbling for her phone. I wanted to tell her to go ahead, but deep down, I knew. We were miles from anywhere. No cell signal. Even if we could call someone, who would get here in time? Then, just ahead I saw it, a fork in the road. Without thinking, I veered left, hoping the van wouldn't be able to react in time. For a second, it looked like we might have shaken them. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. But that relief was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, I saw the van appear around the corner, slower now but still there, still following. "What do they want?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, my voice tight. But I did know. At least, I had a pretty good guess. Whatever we had walked into back at that church, it wasn't just a regular service. It was something dark, something we weren't supposed to see. The van was gaining again. They weren't speeding, just keeping pace, like they wanted us to know they could catch us whenever they felt like it. Fear twisted in my gut. We couldn't outrun them, not in this car. I needed a plan. Fast. Up ahead, I saw a small sign, barely visible in the darkness, Sheriff's Office, 3 miles. It was our only hope. "Sarah," I said, my voice firm now, "we're heading to the sheriff's station." "Hang on." She nodded, gripping the door handle as I floored the gas pedal again. The engine whined, the car shuddering as it fought to keep up the speed. The van's headlights still glared in the mirror, but I could see the sheriff's station now, a small brick building just off the road. It wasn't much, but it was something. As we neared the station, I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the gravel lot. Sarah was out of the car before it even stopped completely, and I followed, my legs shaking as we ran toward the front door. The van pulled in behind us, but for the first time, it didn't seem like they were in any hurry. They parked at the far end of the lot, just sitting there, headlights off, engine idling. "What the hell?" I muttered, my heart racing. We burst through the front door of the sheriff's office, the fluorescent lights flickering above us. Inside, the place was deserted, save for one officer sitting behind a desk, sipping a cup of coffee. He looked up, startled, as we stumbled in. "Can I help you?" he asked, his southern drawl slow and disinterested. "There's a van," I blurted out, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "They've been following us. Since we left a church, something's not right." The sheriff raised an eyebrow and set his coffee cup down. "A van? Following you from a church, you say?" "Yes," Sarah cut in, her voice pleading. Please, they're right outside. The sheriff stood up slowly, his belt creaking as he shifted. He glanced out the window, squinting into the darkness. There's no van out there, he said. My stomach dropped. I whipped around, staring out the window. Sure enough, the lot was empty. No van. No headlights. Just the still, quiet night. How is that possible? Sarah stammered. They were right there. The sheriff gave us a look I couldn't quite read, then picked up his radio. You two sit tight. I'll have a deputy drive out to that church, see if anything's going on. He radioed for backup while Sarah and I sat in the stiff chairs by the door, our minds racing. Where had the van gone? How could it just vanish like that? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The sheriff stood by the window, watching the road, his radio crackling with static every now and then. Finally, the radio buzzed to life, a deputy's voice coming through. Sheriff, I'm out here at St. Mark's. Church is locked up, no cars, no sign of anyone. The sheriff glanced at us, frowning. You're sure? Positive, the deputy said. It's dead quiet out here. I looked at Sarah, my mouth dry. This wasn't making any sense. All right, head back to the station, the sheriff said, clipping the radio to his belt. He walked over to us, his expression unreadable. Looks like it was just a misunderstanding. You folks probably just ran into some locals who didn't appreciate strangers poking around. I shook my head. No, it was more than that. There was a van, and those people, something was wrong. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. I'll keep an eye out, but for now you two should head on home. Warren County's a quiet place. We like to keep it that way. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, but there wasn't much else we could say. We thanked the sheriff and made our way back to the car. The ride home was tense, both of us constantly checking the mirrors, expecting the van to appear again. But it never did. Weeks passed, and life went back to normal, or at least it tried to. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that church, those cold eyes staring at us, and that masked man's voice echoing in my head. We shouldn't have been there, Sarah said one night, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, knowing she was right. But I also knew that whatever we'd stumbled into, it hadn't forgotten us. There's something about the abandoned church that kept calling us back. It wasn't like Sean and I had a death wish or anything. We were just 19-year-old kids with too much time on our hands, living in New Jersey, where there's not much to do at night. That's how we found ourselves standing in front of that decaying building at 2 in the morning, a Ouija board tucked under Sean's arm. The church had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Some people said it was cursed, others said it was haunted. Me? I just thought it was creepy. The kind of place you look at twice when you're driving past, but never get close to. Except tonight, we weren't just getting close. We were going in. Come on, James. It's not like we're gonna see any ghosts, Sean said, his voice shaking just a little. He was always the braver one. The one who came up with the stupid ideas. I glanced at the cracked, peeling wood of the door, and back at Sean. I dunno, man. This place looks like it's gonna fall apart if we breathe too hard. Sean laughed, but it didn't sound real. We'll be fine. Just a quick look, and we'll be out of here. I sighed and pulled out my phone, using the flashlight to cut through the thick darkness. The door creaked open with a sound like a dying animal, and we stepped inside. It was worse than I expected. The place smelled of mold and damp wood. Pews were overturned, broken glass littered the floor, and the air was thick with dust. But what caught my attention was the silence. It was unnaturally quiet. No sounds from the outside world, no wind, no animals, just the heavy weight of stillness. Let's just do this, I muttered, wanting to get it over with. Sean set the Ouija board down in the middle of the floor, right under what used to be the altar. The letters on the board seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and the planchette sat there, waiting for us. We knelt on the cold stone floor, our knees sinking into the dust and grime. We placed our fingers on the planchette, and I immediately regretted this whole thing. "You sure about this?" I asked. "Relax," Sean said, though he didn't sound as confident as he had outside. We sat there for a minute, the board doing nothing. Just silence. Then Sean cleared his throat. "Is there anyone here with us?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. At first, nothing happened. I was about to make a joke, say something to lighten the mood, when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at Sean, who was staring at the board, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," he muttered, barely moving his lips. We waited, but the sound didn't come again. I was about to pull my hand away from the planchette when suddenly, something thudded behind us. We both jumped, spinning around to see nothing. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking now. Sean stood up, shining his flashlight toward the back of the church. "It's probably just some animal or something." But I wasn't convinced. The air felt wrong, heavier than before, like the building itself was watching us. I wanted to leave, but before I could say anything, I heard it again, another thud, this time closer. And then, a small rock rolled across the floor and stopped right on the Ouija board. We both stared at it, frozen. I don't know who moved first, but we bolted. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it was a relief to be out of that place. "What the hell, man?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. That wasn't normal." Sean shook his head, his face pale. "No, it wasn't." We stood there in the dark for a minute, just trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no explanation. Nothing that made any sense, anyway. We didn't say much on the walk back to Sean's car, just kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting something to be following us. When we got back to Sean's place, we finally started talking about it. But no matter how much we went over it, we couldn't agree on what we'd seen, or what we hadn't seen. "I mean, the rock could have just fallen from the ceiling," Sean said, but he didn't sound like he believed it. "Maybe," I muttered. "But what about the sounds? And why did it land right on the board?" Neither of us had an answer. We sat there in silence for a while, the glow of the TV casting long shadows on the walls. "I'm going back tomorrow," Sean said suddenly. "What? Why?" "I left the Ouija board there," he said. "And besides, I want to see if there's anything else. Something we missed." I stared at him, not believing what I was hearing. "You're crazy if you go back there, man." Sean shrugged. "I just need to know." That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those thuds in the back of my mind, and the image of that rock landing perfectly on the board wouldn't leave me alone. Something about it didn't feel right. But by morning I convinced myself that Sean was probably right. It was just a bunch of noises, maybe an animal, maybe the wind. Nothing supernatural, nothing to be afraid of. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. Sean, of course, went back to the church. Alone. He said he'd be back in a couple of hours. By noon, I still hadn't heard from him. I texted him. No reply. I called him. It went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong, but I didn't want to admit it. I told myself maybe his phone died, or maybe he just got caught up in something else. But deep down I knew. I knew something had gone terribly wrong. And I knew that if I didn't do something soon, I might never see Sean again. By the time the sun started to set, I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my jacket and keys, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept telling myself that Sean was fine, that I was overreacting. But every time I picked up my phone and saw no new messages, no calls, that small knot of fear in my gut tightened. The drive back to the church felt different this time. The streets, the trees, everything looked darker, even though it was just twilight. It felt like the world itself was warning me not to go back. But I didn't have a choice. Sean was my best friend, and if something had happened to him, it was my fault for letting him go back alone. When I pulled up to the church, I saw Sean's car parked haphazardly near the edge of the lot. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. The sight of his car, sitting there with the door slightly ajar, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. I stepped out of my car, the air colder than it had been just an hour ago. The sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, and the last traces of daylight were slipping away. I stood there for a moment, staring at the church. The place felt alive somehow, like it was breathing, waiting. "Sean?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty lot. No answer. I walked over to his car and looked inside. His phone was on the passenger seat, the screen cracked. That was when I knew something was very wrong. My hand shook as I pulled out my own phone and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the growing darkness as I walked toward the church doors, which were slightly ajar just like Sean's car door. I pushed them open with a creak that seemed louder than it should have been, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, the same damp, musty air thick with decay. But there was something else now. Something foul, like rotting meat. I gagged, covering my nose and mouth with my sleeve as I moved deeper into the church. "Sean!" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just that suffocating silence. I made my way toward the altar, where we had left the Ouija board the night before. My footsteps echoed off the stone walls, the sound bouncing back at me in a way that made me feel like I wasn't alone. But I didn't see anyone. The Ouija board was gone. The spot where it had been was covered in dust and grime, but the board wasn't there anymore. I knelt down, my flashlight scanning the floor, looking for any sign of Sean. And that's when I saw it, something small and metallic glinting in the beam of my flashlight. I picked it up. It was Sean's keychain. The one with the dumb little alien figurine he always carried. He wouldn't just leave this behind. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood up, turning in a slow circle, my flashlight sweeping the room. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet. The sound came from behind one of the pews. "Sean?" I called, my voice shaking now. "Is that you?" No answer. Just another shuffle, a little closer this time. I walked toward the sound, my heart thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. As I got closer, I saw something, a figure, crouched low behind the pew. Relief flooded through me for a split second. It had to be Sean. But then the figure stood up. It wasn't Sean. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight for a moment before catching it. The beam flickered across the figure's face, and I wish it hadn't. It was wrong. Human, but not. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, its eyes hollow and dark. And it was staring right at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The thing, whatever it was, took a step toward me, slow and deliberate. I backed up, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. But then it stopped, just a few feet away, and it tilted its head, like it was studying me. And then it spoke. In Sean's voice. "James." My blood turned to ice. That voice. It was Sean, but it wasn't. It was distorted, like it was coming from deep inside a tunnel, echoing and hollow. "James, help." It took another step toward me, reaching out with a hand that was too long, too thin, the fingers curling like claws. My body finally reacted. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care what that thing was or where Sean really was. I just knew I had to get out of there. I burst through the church doors and sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. I finally managed to get the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely start the engine, but when it roared to life, I hit the gas and sped out of there as fast as I could. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing chasing me. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road behind me. I kept driving, not slowing down until I was halfway across town, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. When I finally stopped, I realized I was crying. I don't know how long I sat there, my breath ragged, my mind racing. I couldn't process what I had seen, what I had heard. It wasn't until later, when I calmed down enough to think straight, that the real horror set in. Sean was gone. I didn't know where, or if he was even still alive. But whatever that thing was in the church, it had used his voice. It had known his name. And that meant, it had him. I never went back to that church. I couldn't. But every night, I hear his voice in my head, calling for help, distorted and distant, like it's coming from somewhere far away. And every night, I wonder if I made the biggest mistake of my life by leaving him behind.